Hello, everybody, and thank you again for joining this Criterion Edge webinar. For those of you that are not already aware, Criterion Edge is a distinguished global provider dedicated to helping IVD, medical device, and pharmaceutical companies advance compliance and enhance market success through industry-leading regulatory, scientific, and clinical writing services. Our webinar today is part of our Ask the Expert series entitled The Role of Real-World Evidence in Regulatory Submissions, presented by one of our principal writers here at Criterion Edge, Dr. Sheila Grab. From global regulatory challenges, clinical evidence issues, or regulatory writing best practices, the goal of this Q&A format is to share information, ideas, and solutions. Please feel free to bring your questions and join the conversation. Dr. Sheila Grab is a Principal Writer 3 here at Criterion Edge, where she specializes in navigating complex regulatory environments for pharmaceutical companies. With a robust educational background, including a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Sheila brings over a decade of experience in clinical research and scientific writing. Her expertise spans preclinical, clinical, and translational research across multiple therapeutic areas and has experience in developing clinical trial strategies and regulatory documentation. Dr. Sheila's deep understanding of the regulatory process and commitment to excellence help her become an invaluable resource to clients striving for success in the pharmaceutical landscape. I'm now going to hand it off to Sheila to kick it off with today's webinar.
All right. Oh, thank you very much. Sorry, before we jump into our first question, I just want to say thanks for that nice introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. There was a lot of questions submitted upon your registration, so I don't want to delay anymore, and we can just hop into that first question. So the first question is, asking about the difference between real-world data and real-world evidence. And I think this is just a great place to start because we're seeing these terms used a lot of, very often, and we're seeing them being used interchangeably. So, let's get everyone kind of level set and discuss, what these terms actually mean. So real-world data, that's the data that's coming from, patient health, specific, electronic health records, medical claims data, and it's relating to the patient health status and/or the delivery of healthcare routinely collected. Real-world evidence is the evidence about the usage and potential benefits or risks of a medical product, and this is derived from real-world data. So in short, real-world data, it forms the basis for real-world evidence. And this data can come from just a variety of different sources. Once you analyze real-world data, you're generating real-world evidence. And this is such a hot topic right now, and we had our webinar in July, and we're just continuing on because I think we're going to see this become more prevalent in regulatory submissions in the years to come. And we also know that the access to data is changing. So as the electronic health records are more and more common, wearable data is being generated. I think that there's a lot of more options for this data to be used in a really meaningful way. So I think that's a great place to start. I'm going to do my best throughout this presentation to try to really distinguish between real-world data and real-world evidence, and try and follow along and make sure that we're using those terms correctly. All right, so the next question, so what types of real-world data are most valuable for generating real-world evidence in regulatory submission? So this question, I think it's really dependent on, what the goal of using real-world data is. So, if you have a clearly defined goal, you need to make sure that the data can answer or help achieve that goal, answer the question or help achieve that goal. So you don't want to use non-relevant data to generate evidence that doesn't support the question that's being asked. So I think maybe, this question can be answered with, what are the most common types of real-world data that are being used to generate real-world evidence? So, main sources of these are from electronic health records, claims data, Patient registries are very valuable, and these types of data are going to present a really comprehensive picture of patient information. Other data types, like I mentioned before, data generated from wearables like your smartwatch, may be used in more specific situations because they're going to provide a different type of data. That's going to be continuous, real-time, and very personalized data. There's data being generated from social media sources and patient-reported outcome measures. And these data are useful when you're trying to capture patient experiences that may not be fully represented in clinical trials. So I think, before you decide, okay, what types of data should be used, you need to make sure that you have a clearly defined goal or question, and then you figure out what data can be used to help answer that question. Okay, so the next one we have here. So how can real-world data and real-world evidence, so both of them, be effectively utilized throughout the drug development lifecycle? And related to this question are, what are the main uses of real-world data and real-world evidence in drug development? So I think we put these together because I think in general, they're kind of asking the same question. So I think what I'll try to address are, some of the common uses throughout drug development. Making sure it's used effectively is really based on whether the data is able to answer the question being asked. And if the correct analysis to generate that evidence is, providing, data, or I'm sorry, providing evidence that, you can make strong conclusions from. So as we know, historically, real-world data has been used really in later phases of product development. So it can be integrated in various stages of the process, but I think what we're most commonly seeing is it used in post-market surveillance or to fulfill post-market requirements. I think this is changing because it's being integrated earlier and earlier. So it really can be used throughout this drug development life cycle. In preclinical development, I think real-world evidence can be used to help identify target patient populations, to help optimize clinical trial design. It can definitely be used to inform, target product profile development very early on in preclinical development, because it can provide insights into, maybe a targeted indication or the prevalence of a disease or incidence of a disease. I also think, one of the places that we're seeing real-world data and real-world evidence being used is, in terms of the health economics and outcome research and early phase market research. These are really key in being integrated as, pharmaceutical companies are relying more on these data to help address payer needs early in the development process. So the health economics and outcome research, I think we're going to see grow and expand when using this real-world data and real-world evidence. I talked about how it's used in post-market, but it's also really can be used in the clinical phase. I think it's being more commonly implemented to help inform trial design. It can be used to help identify patient populations. In the post-market phase, I think it is, providing a different data set than it is in the clinical phase. And so I think its effective utilization is really based on, like I said before, the questions being asked and how, what questions are being asked and how the data is going to inform decisions to help take the drug through that development process. Okay. All right, so the next question is about some of the common pitfalls when using real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory submissions, and how can these pitfalls be avoided? So real-world data sources, claims data, electronic health records, data from wearables. We know that these data sets are not going to be as straightforward or as clean as data that's being generated from sources like a randomized controlled trial. We know that. these data sets are huge, and they're also, really, sometimes kind of messy and not always presented in a consistent format. So when you think about, data that's being collected as part of everyday clinical practice, timing of assessments is going to vary, across patients. The measurements used in clinical practice versus what's used in research is very different. And so I think there's oftentimes, different data formats and also different documentation formats. So the standardization of the data is not as, across the board as it is as in randomized controlled trials. So I think because of these factors, that's where we see a lot of the pitfalls. These can impact the data reliability and data relevance because, you have these incomplete data sets. The analysis, so pulling out the data that is important, pulling out the data that you need, scraping the data from these large data sets can also lead to some of the pitfalls. So it requires, a team of experts in order to go in and say, okay, what is the true data? Let's pull that out and be able to, put it in a format where it can be utilized. Because if you're, looking at, various electronic health records across systems, you can't just directly compare those. So, you're going to need to take the time to scrape the data, put it in a format where it can be analyzed, and then compare it to other data. It's also important to, remember that protected health information is usually included as part of these data sets. And, this should be removed prior to analysis, and certain, steps need to be taken to, strip the data of these protected health information identifiers. If that's not done correctly, then, potentially the data can't be used. So, you could have a great data set, but if, the protections were not ensured, it can lead to problems when using this data. Access to data is also, a place where we have seen some pitfalls. The data sets need to be independently verified, so that, that ensuring that data is true data is, a key point. So, in our webinar, we talked about some, high impact journal retractions because specific data sources could not be verified. So the, entire paper that was based on these data sets, had to be retracted because no one could go in and independently verify that these were true data. That second part of the question, okay, how can these things be avoided? I just would like to note that here at Criterion Edge, we are writing experts. We are, scientists and writers, and so we can, discuss some of the ways we think this can be avoided, but really this is part of regulatory strategy. And it's, you want to ensure that, the regulatory affairs team and the writers are on the same page to make sure that, it's very clear on what data exists, how it supports the question being asked, and how it's integrated into the writing of specific documents. So I think that, how can these pitfalls be avoided is very, dependent on each individual situation. But identifying potential problems before using data sets is a great way to kind of get in front of these potential issues. I also know that regulatory authorities are really encouraging early interaction so that, certain pitfalls can be avoided, so that it's not upon, the time of submission where you're identifying potential issues. You can meet with regulatory agencies early on in this process, and, they might flag certain things that need to be addressed before the analysis is complete. All right, we can go on to the next question. So how can real-world data complement traditional clinical trial data and regulatory submissions? So I think this question, is really highlighting the way that real-world data is currently being used. So real-world data is being generated in addition to traditional data from randomized controlled trials. So as we know, randomized controlled trials are considered the gold standard. I think that the real-world data is coming in and it's filling gaps that are not able to be achieved in the rigid structure of randomized controlled trials. So, RCTs are not what's happening in the real world. And so I think whenever you have real world data generation, this is outside of a controlled situation. And I think this is more reflective of actual human behavior. And so I think these data are used to inform different pathways. I'm not saying that the data from RCTs are not, to be used. These are the gold standard. That's the data that, is being generated as part of regulatory submissions. But I do think that more and more we're seeing, real world data studies help to fill certain holes. So some of the ways that I think real world data is doing this is, it's like I said, it's kind of, filling gaps that are not achieved, but it's also helping to provide, insights into patient populations that are either underrepresented or not represented in controlled trials. Maybe the elderly population or pregnant women or children. We know it's being used to assess long-term safety and efficacy. And it can also be used to support comparative effectiveness research. So it can allow for comparisons between different treatment options in real-world clinical practice. That's not data that you're going to see in an RCT. So I think it's really bridging gaps in scenarios where RCTs are either not feasible or not providing the complete data set that is really needed for these regulatory submissions. All right, next question. All right, what role does real-world evidence play in post-market surveillance, and how does it impact regulatory decisions? So like I said, this is where we're seeing real-world data generation to provide real-world evidence is mainly in the post-market phase. This can provide information on long-term safety, efficacy, can help detect rare adverse events, and overall it's used to support that ongoing risk-benefit analysis. Because it's outside of this controlled trial, it's often very helpful to generate data on maybe new risks or new adverse events that may arise from real-world use of a product. So these data are informing post-market use and can be used for potential changes to labeling or even off-label use. I think the registry data can be used to help expand indications or even identify distinct populations that would be most benefit from a drug or therapy. But I think right now what we're seeing is it's really used to help monitor safety after drug approval. More and more, I think we'll start to see it, maybe used to support effectiveness. It can help regulators understand how well this product is working in different patient populations. Like I said, those populations outside of a randomized controlled trial, like the elderly or pregnant women or pediatrics. So next question is, how should real-world evidence be presented in regulatory submissions to maximize its impact? Excuse me. So as with any regulatory submission, you're going to want to make sure that the information that you are presenting is very clear. And that is really where the writing experts can help. We have the experience with how to take all of the information that you want to include in regulatory submission and present it in a way that is very easy for a regulatory agency to understand. When using specific real-world data and real-world evidence, you really want to make sure that the goal and the rationale for using real-world data and real-world evidence is very, very clear. The source of real-world data needs to also be, very clearly specified. And, you need to do some internal assessment to make sure that the data sources are reliable, that they're trustworthy and credible, and that the data is relevant, meaning that it is adequate to address the regulatory goal. And like I said before, engagement with regulatory agencies very early in the process can help with, enhancing how this data is presented, and also making sure that you identify any holes or pitfalls before your regulatory submission. You need to ensure that, access to data is addressed so that the data can be made available and verified. If human subject data is being used, you want to make sure that you have ensured the protection of the human subjects. You remove protected health information or have specific plans in place, and that you follow applicable requirements for either IRB ethics committee for approval and for the protection of human subjects. So you just want to make sure that you're providing a complete data package and that this is very clearly conveyed to the regulatory authorities. All right, next question. So what are the ethical considerations when using real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory submissions? So I really like this question because I think that these ethical considerations are oftentimes overlooked. I think everyone is excited to get access to data, get their hands on the data. What questions can this data, answer? But we're not thinking about, how this data should be presented and how, specific information should be protected. So I think that data privacy and access to protected health information is really at the heart of this question. We tend to focus on the regulatory impact, but the ethical considerations are kind of taking more of a back seat. And I think this is important even if it's not, sometimes the primary focus. So I think some of the questions around this, is the data that's being used to generate real-world evidence, is it private? Have all of the identifiers been stripped? So, thinking about what are they doing with the data from your smartwatch or health record before they're giving access to it? I don't think we know that. I think there's, some general ideas, but, we cannot ensure that, my data has all of my personal health information stripped from it. We also have to question, so who's getting the permission to use this data? And are they ensuring that they're not given, are they ensured, that they're not getting access to information that they shouldn't get access to? I know that regulatory agencies are really stressing the importance of human subject protections, ensuring patient privacy, that should be part of your regulatory submission. But I think sometimes this is coming a little bit too, these considerations are happening, after data has been accessed or after the analysis has begun. And so I think moving, these considerations to the forefront and, thinking about them earlier in the process is going to kind of help streamline some of these regulatory submissions and also, help hopefully avoid any of the pitfalls that could arise if a data set is used, that contains information that no one should have access to. So I think that this is really going to be, an evolving field. I don't know, if that is the full answer to this question. I think we're going to keep seeing more and more about this, but it really should be, at the forefront when anyone's going to be using real-world data to generate real-world evidence. Okay, so what are the future trends in the use of real-world evidence for regulatory submission? All right, so if I had a crystal ball that I could look into, I think that would help me answer this question. But I can take the information that exists now, look at how things have changed over the last years and share where I think this is going to go. I think that we're going to see more integration of real-world evidence into regulatory submissions outside of what we're typically seeing, which is that post-market phase to fulfill post-market requirements. I think using that as part of some of the preclinical steps to establish a target product profile, engage with the health economics outcome research groups. I think we're going to be seeing more and more of that. I also think that the use of AI as part of real-world evidence generation is going to accelerate. I think we're going to see AI being used more and more to help look at these data sets and strip the relevant data from these data sets. We're seeing, a lot of regulatory agencies develop guidelines and frameworks for the use of real-world data and real-world evidence. And I just think that's going to continue to increase. So, the broader acceptance of real-world data and real-world evidence is just going to increase. I was actually reading an article, I think it was this morning, where I saw that over 90% of pharmaceutical companies have real-world evidence teams. So I think this is an indicator of what is to come. I think that, hopefully real-world data and real-world evidence can be used to cut down time to regulatory approval. I think that is the ultimate goal, and that it's going to be used to inform clinicians and patients so that overall healthcare is improved. But I think this is an exciting field, and I think we're going to kind of grow and learn together. And I think, looking to, back each year to see, how many new drug approvals used real world evidence. I think we're going to see that continue to grow. And I know that the FDA is actually publishing data on how many submissions per year, have aspects of real world evidence integration. And, over the last, 3 to 5 years, we're seeing that go up. And I think that's going to increase even more. Okay. Next one. So what is the acceptance of real world evidence by different regulatory agencies? So, regulatory agencies around the world, are all, increasingly accepting of real world evidence, but, there's definitely challenges. I think if you attended our webinar in July, you'll remember, I showed an interactive map where it showed kind of the current status of real world evidence and real world data are throughout the world. And I believe, at that time, there was around 13 countries that had real world evidence and real world data published documents. And the number of countries that have these documents, as well as the number of guidance documents and frameworks, that's continuing to increase. I would say right now, across agencies, real world evidence is generally accepted to help support post-approval safety surveillance. That's where we're constantly seeing it. But I think, use in early development in other phases of drug life cycle is becoming more recent. So I think this is an evolving field. I know that there are approvals from Health Canada and EMA, as well as the FDA, that have, used parts of, real world evidence in order to support that regulatory approval. I can't list those off the top of my head, but, regulatory agencies are, developing these frameworks and guidance documents so that it's easier for applicants to include this as part of their submissions in order to strengthen these submissions. Like I said, this real world data is being used to complement data from randomized controlled trials. And I think the regulatory agencies see the impact and importance of this, and they want to continue to, push applicants to use it if it is making the submission stronger. Okay, next question is about AI. All right, so how can AI be used in collecting real world evidence? So just remember, we don't really collect real world evidence, we collect real world data, and then the evidence is derived from the data. I am, as much as I wish I was an AI expert, I am not. But like I said, I think that, AI is being used to scrape the relevant databases to get relevant real world data that can be used for analysis. I think that, AI is going to be integral in processing and analyzing some of that unstructured data in order to make these, huge data sets usable, in order to boil the data down into something that can be understood and used for analysis. It's being used to organize this information in a more understandable way. I've also read that AI is being, AI diagnostic tools are being used in medical imaging, to help with image interpretation. But I think the big way I would see it being used right now is really in data scraping, and so that teams can analyze it. I do think, like I said, this is one of the trends I wanted to kind of mark, because I think this is a rapidly evolving field. And I think that AI will help take over some of the burden, from these huge data analytics teams that are needed to scrape the data. I think, they'll start using AI to reduce that burden. All right, next question. What are the differences, or what are the differences of using real-world evidence during product development versus during post-market surveillance? So I think, the data that is being used is really what differentiates the use of real-world evidence throughout phases of drug development. So, what data set is being used to answer the specific question? So in the post-market phase, the data being used to generate real-world evidence is, focused on the long-term product safety, identifying new adverse events. It's monitoring the real-world use of the drug or product. So that same data is not being used in the early development stage. So in early development, data maybe like electronic health records and claims might be used as opposed to post-market surveillance data, because a different question's being asked. So electronic health record data could be used to maybe identify a disease or an indication that is proving to be a significant burden in the population. In the clinical phase, again, you're going to use a different data set because you're asking different questions. So, data that are being used to inform study design and planning or identify patient populations based on exclusion criteria is the goal potentially in the clinical phase. So again, you're not going to use data from post-market to inform this phase of development. So I think the different types of real-world data are really going to, specify, when they're, the different data sets can really help answer different questions in each phase of development. All right, next question. What is the FDA's current feedback about real-world evidence? So FDA has been using real-world evidence for a long time to evaluate the safety of approved drugs after they have been released to the market. They have stated that the integration of real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory decision-making is one of their priorities. And they, created the framework in 2018 for evaluating the potential use of real-world evidence to support the approval of a new indication for an already approved drug. They are continuously publishing guidance documents regarding real-world data and real-world evidence. And they're also sharing data on the number of submissions to CBER and CDER that contain real-world evidence. So I think that these activities are showing that the FDA is forward-thinking in trying to promote the effective use of real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory submission. They're also encouraging applicants and sponsors to engage with them early so that any of the pitfalls that we discussed can be addressed and that these data can be used appropriately. So I think they're very proactive about encouraging sponsors and applicants to start generating this data and effectively integrate it into these different types of applications. I think that's our last question for today. So I thank everyone for their questions. We hope to see you in any of our upcoming webinars. If you use the QR code on the left, you can sign up to receive notifications for upcoming webinars. And I think that you can submit additional questions that we maybe didn't have time to answer today, but can hopefully get back to you on.
Lovely. Thank you again for everyone that was able to attend today. As a friendly reminder, everyone here is eligible for a free consult to discuss either a current or upcoming project with one of our experts. If you wish to take advantage of this offer, feel free to pick a day and time that works best for you using the link that's in the chat. Alternatively, you can also email us at consult at criterionedge.com, and we'll be happy to get something on the calendar. Our team will stay on for another couple minutes for anybody that has any last remaining questions. If not, we'll give you all about 8 minutes back to your Wednesday and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.